Marvel is in deep trouble. Flop after flop has done major damage to both Marvel's bottom line and their reputation. Fans have snubbed nearly all of the Marvel releases since Endgame, and for a good reason. Lots have been uninspired, poorly written, and feel detached from what people love about the franchise. But how bad has the damage to Marvel really been? Well, let's take a look at Black Widow, a movie that barely made back its production costs, grossing $380 million compared to a $200 million budget. And yes, at first this does seem like a profit, however the marketing costs of this film alone made it so that its gross revenue never matched its budget. And it only gets worse from here, with Marvel recently spending around $200 million each on Eternals and She-Hulk, with both films receiving incredibly poor reviews. The internet mocked these films. They were a joke. All of these releases have meant hundreds of millions of losses for Marvel, but just a few years ago, they were on top of the world. Their multi-billion-dollar story was reaching its crescendo, and they were pulling in billions with nearly every single film. Their reputation was spectacular. So then how did Marvel's fortunes turn in such a short time? Why is the company flopping? And what's causing this massive decline in their reputation? Well, by looking at their origins and their golden age, we can see what made Marvel so successful, because only then can we explain where it all went so wrong. You see, in its earliest years, Marvel wasn't even called Marvel. It was first known as Timely Publications, who released the first issue of Marvel Comics in 1939. It was a major success, and through the Second World War, superheroes like the Human Torch and Captain America sold millions of copies. At the time, comics were a relatively new medium, but Marvel worked to push them into the mainstream. And it was also during this period that two men began working for Marvel who would define its future: Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. They both understood how big the comic business was going to be, and they wanted their piece of the pie. And with World War II drawing to a close, the Marvel team could see that the world was changing fast, and the company needed to adapt. So after the war ended and patriotic sentiment started to die down, these patriotic superheroes saw their popularity start to fade. And as people stopped buying the sorts of superhero comics they loved in World War II, Marvel would stop selling them, moving into other genres like horror and comedy to survive. But this wasn't an easy transition. The company really struggled through the late 40s and 50s, with Marvel eventually being forced to work with a distributor owned by their competitors DC Comics. It seemed like the company could never scale up. DC Comics dominated them, and we can see this quite clearly with how much DC Comics controlled Marvel. You see, before the change in distributors, Marvel were releasing 50 to 60 comic books a month, but now that they were under control of DC Comics, they had to slash this to around 10, all so that DC Comics could slowly cripple the company. But Stan Lee and Jack Kirby weren't going to take this line down. Forced to give up pushing a large quantity of comics, the pair decided to focus on quality instead, and this is what would change everything. You see, Stan and Jack understood their strengths lay in superhero comics, and recently they'd seen that DC Comics was now actually finding some success in revitalizing the genre. So the pair created new characters like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, all to compete with Batman and Superman. But these heroes weren't as one-dimensional as their predecessors. They had complex motivations and personal issues. Spider-Man was driven by regret and loss, while the Thing was an ugly outcast scorned by society. Instead of representing the ideal 50s golden age period of American society, they subverted it. They showed the flaws and ugliness in the system, and their complex stories were extended over years, building a much more fleshed out and interesting story that was completely new to superheroes. And this approach turned out to be amazingly successful. DC Comics had inadvertently catalyzed their competitors, and this is when Marvel would begin their golden age. The Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, the X-Men, a wealth of iconic heroes made their debut during this period, with their comics appealing to both children and young adults. It was something new, and 60s counterculture jumped on it as a fresh artistic medium. And in 1965, a list of college campus heroes by Esquire magazine saw Spider-Man and the Hulk competing with Bob Dylan and JFK in popularity. And by 1968, Marvel was selling 50 million comics a year, and the limits put in place by the distributor were finally released. With Marvel Unchained, they were free to build on their success. But in 1970, a rift opened that threatened to tear the company in two. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had built Marvel's reputation through their creative partnership, but Kirby suddenly left the company, courted by their rival DC Comics. This wouldn't stop Marvel though. They were determined to stay at the top, and continue to see record-breaking sales figures. And eventually Kirby realized his mistake, as in 1972, Marvel finally surpassed DC, and the next few years proved to be immensely successful for Marvel, as they stayed strong throughout the entire decade. But as far as the greater industry was concerned, the 70s were a rough time for comics. Their popularity dipped once again, as they fell out of the public consciousness and became a more specialist product. But even when sales began to fall, Marvel once again adapted to the change. You see, whilst other comic companies focused on a futile attempt to gain more fans in a shrinking market, Marvel didn't. They instead focused on catering to to their loyal fanbase, which Stan Lee and Kirby had built up over the course of decades. In this time, Marvel focused on building their own characters more, giving them richer and richer backstories and identities, using the zeitgeist of the 60s and 70s to show an imperfect America, an America that showed weak men turning into strong men. Their story served as allegorical messages for teens around the world, and this is how Marvel kept their fans for years and years, and it allowed the company to see through their hard times. However, this extended Marvel universe wasn't a new concept. It had all been planned as early as 1961, but during the 70s it really started to take shape, drawing people who were already fans to explore other Marvel creations. And whenever Marvel went through tough times, it was these fans that made sure they had a future. Without them, Marvel were just a few bad years away from disaster. It was this concept of constant adaptability, deepening of their characters, and devotion to their fanbase that would prove vital to Marvel's success, because the core fanbase they created during their golden age would keep them afloat for years to come. And Marvel wasn't just passively gaining this fanbase through comics alone, they actively worked to grow it by organizing special Marvel events and making deals with new specialist comic book stores, resulting in the first MarvelCon that was held in 1975. And at the event, Stan Lee made a shock announcement. After a disappointing time at DC Comics, Jack Kirby was finally returning to the company. However, once again, their time would be short, with Kirby leaving soon afterwards, and Stan Lee also stepped down from working from comics, staying at Marvel for the next 2 decades as just a chairman and public figurehead. However, this didn't stop Marvel's success, because even throughout the late 70s and 80s, when comics were losing lots of their popularity, Marvel was sustaining themselves by appealing to their core fanbase at all times. And once the 90s rolled around, the ever-changing market for comic books suddenly picked up again, and with demand for comics skyrocketing, people looked to Marvel at the top of the industry. And Marvel wasn't going to be passive about this golden rush, they would take full advantage of it, as they expanded into new mediums, releasing 2 incredibly successful Saturday morning cartoon shows based on the X-Men and Spider-Man. However, the same couldn't be said for films. In 1990, Marvel tried to bring Captain America to cinemas for the first time, but after millions were spent on production, the end product was so bad that it was never even released to theaters. Instead, it was only released in video, and even with this, it sold incredibly poorly. In the end, Marvel lost millions from this movie, and it would take them many years before they tried again. However, when they did try again in 1998, Marvel finally achieved box office success with Blade, a gritty movie about a vampire hunter. Then 2 years later, Marvel finally struck gold with the first X-Men movie, pulling in over $400 million. Then came the first Spider-Man movie a year later, then another X-Men movie, both of which were extremely successful commercially and for building their reputation. And by using the money they gained from these giant films, Marvel slowly expanded their film portfolio. However, the movie that would change Marvel forever was Iron Man. Released in 2008, it was a huge hit, grossing nearly $600 million, putting it in the top 10 films of the entire year in revenue. But it wasn't just Iron Man's individual success that showed potential, but what it meant for the superhero film genre. With the great reactions to these recent movies, Marvel knew they had something incredibly valuable in their hands. And it wasn't just Marvel taking notice. Disney, who had long been their competitors for who owned the most beloved characters, saw the potential of a Marvel movie franchise and the overall value of the company. So Disney ended up buying them for $4 billion. And in 2009, the deal went through and Disney made it abundantly clear they were most interested in Marvel's cinematic potential, making plans for strings of releases, covering the origins and introductions of some of Marvel's most famous superheroes. But Marvel weren't just going to haphazardly release superhero movies and tie them together afterwards. Instead, they created and experimented with a strict structure of their movies. But lots of what made the MCU so great was based on what fueled Marvel's golden age. As just like in Marvel's golden age, lots of focus was placed on visuals of the movie. With a few exceptions, Marvel's special effects were second to none. Another lesson from the golden age was that character development and attachment were king in creating an engaging universe. Marvel ensured this by choosing the best actors and let them have their own freedoms in the direction of their characters. That's why the MCU would never have been as popular without Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man or Chris Evans as Captain America. Investment in these characters is what made the MCU possible in the first place. And another part of what created Marvel's golden age was the continuity of the universe. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby made sure of this by constantly building on their characters and their place in the universe. At first, the heroes were kept in separate boxes, but over time they were allowed to blend into each other's stories, creating a seamless transition into a greater narrative. All the while, an overarching threat was introduced and slowly built up to keep readers interested. And so when it came to making movies, Marvel had developed the perfect structure. They kept the same crews working on the same stories across multiple films. This was shown clearly when nearly 70% of the people who worked on the second Captain America sequel also worked on the first movie, and over half of the people working on Iron Man 2 had experience working on the original. This ensured a level of consistency that helped create a seamless transition between movies, and this was also combined with similar stories and villains, which were an essential part of Marvel's formula. But even with these strict structures, Marvel still ensured that their films wouldn't always feel the same. They hired directors who were nearly always new to the superhero genre, while still ensuring they had enough love for the source material. Marvel actually gave these directors much more creative freedom than you'd expect, which is why for Marvel fans, each movie seemed like a unique take on the genre, and over the course of the MCU, these principles were put to work again and again, and all to great success. Attention to the source material was key, as were talented directors and actors, and a sense of continuity between movies. Possibly the biggest draw for the MCU was its greater narrative. Although all of the films had their own self-sufficient stories, they also contributed to the greater plot of Thanos and the Infinity Stones. And as the MCU went on, the finale to the whole saga drew closer and closer. That wasn't until the most recent Avenger movies, Infinity War and Endgame. Infinity War was unlike any other Marvel movie, in the way that it gave the villain the treatment they usually save for the hero, showing the struggles, the sacrifices, the endless hard decisions Thanos had to make to find his own success. In a way, the story was almost allegorical, with the Thanos character being a philosophical and sympathetic portrayal of a villain that Marvel fans just hadn't seen before, with Infinity War becoming so popular that it grossed over $2 billion in box office sales. And the amount of hype it generated for Endgame was unlike anything ever seen before. Millions of fan theories polluted the internet in the year between the releases. People were highly engaged in the Marvel franchise. It seemed like they were unstoppable. Unfortunately for Marvel, Endgame was also a huge success. However, within the film, there were some red flags for what was to come. You see, Marvel had slowly been drawn to appeasing political leanings over the course of the MCU. In lots of cases, this was incredibly lucrative, especially with Disney's close relationship with BlackRock. And in the wake of Black Panther's wild success, Marvel was always starting to lean more and more into social issues, to the detriment of the stories of their movies. And Endgame had a particularly on the nose and unsubtle scene about female empowerment. And whilst Marvel and Disney tried to shoehorn this in, it wasn't really a concern to most people, as it did little to detract from the overall quality of the movie. But there was another problem that was far more worrying for Marvel. You see, Endgame was cathartic, and it satisfied their fans because of its finality. It beautifully closed multiple character arcs and the overall Infinity Stone saga, but it did little to step up the next overall arc for Marvel, the multiverse. And so Marvel was now faced with the question of what's next? And alongside Marvel's loss of their grand motivation, they've also lost two of the most valuable characters. Both Iron Man and Captain America were what drove MCU's plot progression, and with them now gone, lots of fans lost a ton of motivation to see the next Marvel movie. It just wouldn't be the same without Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans. You see, Marvel had seen such success. Infinity War raked in $2 billion in box office sales alone, and now Endgame had become the second highest grossing movie of all time, only being beaten by Avatar, with Marvel making nearly $3 billion from the box office alone for Endgame. But this was all at a cost, as Marvel had now cashed in two of their most beloved characters and a whole lot of motivation for Endgame. And this lack of purpose for the company would lead to its slippery downfall. And this could be clear with Black Widow, The Eternals, and Shang-Chi, all of which only made $400 million for similar budgets. And whilst this might seem like a profit, the truth is a lot more complicated, as a large part of the expenses came out of marketing costs, which are often much more than production budgets. And so with these three releases having $200 million budgets and $400 million box office results, it's really unlikely that they actually managed to break even, let alone make a profit. And aside from the poor commercial results, these new Marvel releases were disappointing in lots of other ways, because simply they were just poor movies, far cries from Marvel's old standards. Which begs the question, what caused Marvel to suddenly start sucking so much? Well, this is simply because they had strayed too far from their original principles, and with Disney making Marvel a cash cow, this came at the cost of their long-term vision. As lots of the things that made the MCU so successful were now just non-existent in these films, as usually Marvel employed directors who were at least somewhat experienced. Black Widow's director, Kate Shortland, had only directed 3 films before Black Widow, with years in between each one. The same is true of Chloe Zhao, who directed Eternals, and this lack of experience left them ill-equipped to tackle the immense project that Marvel gave them. Another of Marvel's principles that had been broken is their attention to the overall structure. The most recent Marvel releases have been the most deviated from the general template. Whilst this could be considered a good thing if it allows for new creative directions for the MCU, it hasn't panned out this way. Instead, lots of Phase 4 feels almost regretful that it's even Marvel property, trying desperately to fit itself into other genres. And in doing so, it loses the key elements that make Marvel films so successful. But possibly the greatest sin that these releases committed was that they barely paid any attention to an overarching theme at all. By not integrating themselves with the rest of the MCU in this way, they feel disconnected and isolated. Without a greater motivation, there's no larger reason for fans to come back for the next Marvel movie. And possibly the worst sin of MCU's Phase 4 is that it's alienated their core fans. Over Marvel's entire history, we've seen comic books and superheroes go in and out of fashion. The only thing that saved Marvel in its harder years is its dedicated and loyal fanbase. With Endgame's release and the overall lack of enthusiasm for Marvel, we may be just seeing the superhero trend start to die down again. But instead of making sure that the core fanbase is happy and engaged, Marvel's new releases have seemed specifically designed to alienate them, which was most evident in one of Marvel's newest releases, She-Hulk. Now, She-Hulk seems to stand with everything that's wrong with Marvel and Disney. It commits all the sins we've already talked about, and it goes way further than that. The directors seem to have no respect for the source material and actively fought against it. Instead of an exciting story about superheroes, allegorical messages of overcoming adversity, the show instead revolves around yes queen attitudes and twerking. There's no character arc at all. The world changes to accommodate her instead. And what makes the show so revolting is that it's filled with virtue signaling and heavy-handed political messages, instead of an actual coherent story. Even Marvel's usually stellar special effects were lacking. She-Hulk looks incredibly bad in comparison to Thanos or nearly any other Marvel CG character, and all of this combined creates the perfect storm of failure, and that's exactly what happened with She-Hulk. The show barely made it into the top 10 streaming series upon release, dropping off of the list just weeks afterwards, with audiences hating the show, which was reflected in its awful 33% user score on Rotten Tomatoes. And now, to be clear, not all of Marvel's releases have bombed. The newer Spider-Man movies have been massive successes, loved by both fans and critics alike. The Doctor Strange and Black Panther sequels have also been somewhat successful, as was Thor: Love and Thunder. Although these films were only successful because they stuck to Marvel's winning formula and served as a continuation for already beloved characters. It wasn't just woke nonsense being stuffed down audiences' throats, but with Disney's overarching influence over Marvel, this might change in the coming years. And so it's clear that Marvel's future depends on which of these paths they choose. By repairing their relationship with their core fanbase, they could stay relevant for decades to come. But if they don't pay enough attention to the fans, if they keep virtue signaling, if they keep stuffing in this woke nonsense, we're just gonna see more and more of these She-Hulk type flops. And only time will tell whether Marvel can get back on the right path or fade into history.